All right, everybody. It is time for a video lecture. Yay! You don't think I would just send you the YouTube videos, do ya? No! They're not going to tell you the stuff that you need to know, the stuff that only I can tell you, because maybe only I think it's true. No, that's just, who knows. Anyway, I hope you're all sheltering in place and doing well and keeping healthy. As always, I'm worried about you and your safety. Uh, I just want you to do well. Before we get started on this, uh, let me remind you I've been sending out announcements, and I'll send out an announcement about this. But let me remind you that one of the very last things I want you to be spending your mental energy on. Hello, Kala. One of the very last things I want you spending your mental energy on during this crisis is your grade. I'm providing content so that you can continue to learn and get the value out of this class uh, that you need to get. But I don't want you worried about your grade. Um, I'm going to make the assignments that we have remaining very simple, easy to complete. And this is Kala. She's our oldest. Uh, how old are you now, Kala? Are you like 13 or 14? She does pretty well. Anyway, the assignments are going to be very easy to complete, very simple. You'll be able to work on them at your own pace. Please don't worry about this. Focus on yourself, your families, your financial situation. Take care of yourself in this time. Uh, I don't want you to stress about this. I want you to be able to learn. I want you to still get something out of this class because you paid for it and you should. So I'm providing content. But please don't make this into a source of stress for yourself. It should not be. Anyway, uh, so hopefully you've watched the other videos, the YouTube links that I've sent you by the time you see this. Uh, the other YouTube links, I should say, technically, since this is going to be on my YouTube channel. Hopefully you've watched the other YouTube links that I've sent you. The crash course, the overly sarcastic, the other stuff. And that should give you a good grasp on the history. But what I want to highlight is, as always, the sort of intellectual development, the ideas, uh, and how the important concepts shaped what was going on during the development of the Roman Republic. Okay, so now, as we discussed the topic today is going to be uh, the rise and, to a certain extent, the fall of the Roman Republic, uh, and what was going on there, and what happened, and why it happened. Now, the first thing to point out is that it would be sheer arrogance for me to say, well, I can tell you why the Roman Republic fell, um, when so many historians have said that, it's very difficult, and there are a lot of factors. And you'll read all kinds of crazy stuff. Uh, that it used to be thought that primarily the migration of the German barbarians in the north was the reason why Rome fell. I don't think that's accurate. Uh, there have even been crazy ideas like lead in the pipes. I don't know. I mean, maybe that contributed to it, the water pipes. Um, but at the core of it, there was there were some indisputable things going on that, if it didn't cause the republic to collapse, then it certainly was a contributing factor, and a major one at that. Yes, it's your laptop. Kala is scent marking the laptop. That's why the camera keeps moving. Anyway, and we're going to talk about what was going on, this major contributing factor. But in order to do that, we have to touch on a few concepts that we've already touched on in class before, and deploy a few new concepts. So, okay. The first thing I want to talk about is the development of government in Rome. And I'm going to keep it general because trying to go into the specifics of the Roman government is a trip into madness. It's very complicated, very technical. We don't need to go into that. If you remember, and I'm going to put up a slide because I'm technically sophisticated like that. A slide, you'll see it in a moment probably. Um, if you remember when we talked about the simple kingship model, uh, or chieftainship, depending on how you want to look at that. Basically, if you assume that in primitive is the wrong word, it's very chauvinistic. If you assume that in pre-agricultural societies, like hunter-gatherer societies or pastoralist societies, the main unit of organization is the family. It's a natural unit. It has natural heads. The parents are naturally in charge. They naturally hold authority over the children. And what is needed then in a society with more than one family is for a way for the families to interact with each other and resolve disputes. Now, what happens in pretty much all the cultures we know of is that they evolve or develop some sort of chief position, some sort of position of authority that may or may not be hereditary. It may be based on age, usually is based on age, or some sort of facility with the ritual beliefs, the religion, the mythological paradigm. We talked about that. That the society occupies. Eventually, what happens is, as societies start to become agricultural, they start to stockpile resources, right? That's the whole point. We brought that up. Hunter-gatherers can't stockpile resources. Pastoralists can kind of stockpile resources in the form of cattle, of animals. The agriculturalists can actually warehouse the stuff. They can harvest wheat and stick it in a building and just keep it there. And then they can go to the building and get wheat and eat it. It's fantastic. So once it becomes possible to stockpile resources, warfare becomes a reasonable way of acquiring resources. You see the connection, right? Imagine you got two hunter-gatherer bands. There's very little reason to develop a sophisticated and organized system of warfare or approach to warfare, because what would you get out of it? What would be the point of risking your life and the lives of the other people in your society? If you've got some people who are in your territory and won't leave, maybe. But other than that, why? Why bother? But once you have warfare, or once you have agriculture, warfare becomes a way of acquiring large amounts of resources. If you can take over the territory or even just raid an enemy and carry off what they have in their warehouse, you may gain an enormous amount of life-sustaining wheat or food or some other resource that you need. So what happens is the leadership positions begin to develop into positions related to their capacity for warfare. War leaders are the ones who become important. And as technology develops, as bronze develops and then iron at the end of the second millennium, as technology develops, you get the ability to, or you you get an equivalence between wealth and effectiveness in warfare, because the better stuff that you can afford to outfit yourself with, uh, the less chance you have of being killed, and the better chance you have of killing your enemy. There's a direct correlation there, and it's not like it was like in hunter-gatherer days. Everyone has the same roughly sharp stone tied to a stick, and who cares? A guy without a weapon, a guy who just picked up a rock, is almost as deadly. So, okay, fine. It doesn't matter. But as the technology increases, so too does the benefit of having access to the technology. And access to the technology is going to go hand in hand with wealth. So what you have is, as warfare becomes important, as a social practice, as a way of gaining resources, and then warfare becomes important, and wealth thus becomes important, right? I mean, wealth was always going to be important in any stratified society. You can see how the wealthy are the ones who wind up running things, right, in a warfare-oriented society. By the way, um, this is going a little deeper than we probably need to go, but just as a free bit of knowledge for you. Uh, Warfare is a primary way of gaining resources in these ancient societies, because international trade, that is to say, trade from one society to another, it's present, but it's not super effective, especially under autocratic despots, like we talked about, autocracy, Mesopotamian-style autocracy. Um, because they're not bound by the rule of law, trade is far less effective with them. You can't count on that. So in order to acquire wealth, they basically acquire it through warfare. Anyway, my point is, my point, huh? My point is, in places that develop simple kingship rather than autocracy, the reasons that we see this are lower agricultural production. In a place with high agricultural production, the excess resources produced are sufficient to support a large bureaucracy and a large standing military that allow the autocrat to exercise power from the top down and control over everything. In places like Greece and Italy, where the where the geographical conditions are not favorable to that kind of massive agricultural surplus, you don't get enough to support a massive bureaucracy. You get enough to support the families, and that's basically it. So you have some families that are richer than others and better equipped, and those are the aristocrats, the aristocracy, the layer of the wealthy people. But, and they are going to have some power over families immediately below them, but sort of the aristocrats have power amongst themselves, where it is very difficult for one of them to rise up to the point where they can institute top-down autocratic control. And as a result, what happens is you get the development of a king or someone else who's an authority over the rest of the aristocrats, in a certain sense, by virtue of the other aristocrats allowing the king to be in control. The king would very rarely command enough resources to force control over the aristocracy. The aristocracy have to sort of go along with it, or at least a majority of them. Anyway, okay, so as we saw in Greece, what happens is this simple kingship model gives way to a city-based, the polis system, a city-state based rule of law, where the aristocracy basically says, instead of just letting one of us decide how to settle disputes. Why don't we just set up a system that will settle the disputes in a fair and non-arbitrary fashion? And that's how you create laws. I mean, just imagine, um, imagine you've got a group of friends, and they can never quite decide where to go for lunch. You guys go out for lunch regularly. You can never. Everyone squabbles over it, and so the first way that they decide to resolve this is to appoint one member of the group to make the decision. But eventually, after that member of the group abuses their power enough times, or people just get tired of their decisions, eventually they say, you know what, instead of this, let's just set up a rotation. Or, in other words, effectively to create a law about how you decide where to go. And you've gotten rid of that position that is analogous to the king, and you've set up something analogous to the rule of law. Okay, so what happened in Rome is that sometime around 500, or so, uh, sometime around 500 or so, the aristocracy chased off the last king of Rome, Tarquin the Proud, Tarquin Superbus, uh, in Latin. Anyway, they replaced this with, as we mentioned in class, the republic, the res publica, the public thing that belonged to all Romans. Now, that was the rhetoric, that Rome belonged to the Romans, Rome for the Romans. And it was a res publica. And the Senate, the Roman Senate, their deliberative body, was an important part of running the res publica. Uh, but the rhetoric did not match the reality. Um, the rhetoric was that it belonged to all Romans, and that the Senate, made up of elected senators, would sort of serve as the major deliberative body for running Rome, and that's fine. There were other elected offices. We don't need to talk about them. But the point is that the Senate, at first, you could only be a member of the Senate if you had the right background, if you were a member of the nobility, if you were one of the aristocrats, a wealthy person with the right family history. Only then could you be a member of the Senate. And if you were a regular working class Joe, or I guess a working class Plautus, or whatever we want to say for the Roman name, right? Anyway, it's funnier. It's funny to me. It doesn't matter if you care if it's funny. I know I'm hilarious. I don't need your approval. Anyway, I do. I crave it all the time. All the time. Anyway, I can't get my kite to stay lit. Sorry. Anyway, if you were a regular working class scholar, or lady, um, you didn't have a lot of input into the government. Uh, and what would happen over the next several hundred years is that the working class, the common people, or as the Romans would call them, the plebs, the plebeians would fight ardently to expand their representation and their rights in the public system, in the republic, in the public thing, the res publica. Um, and over the next several hundred years, the working class, the plebeians, would become more and more represented. The power previously held exclusively by the aristocrats would come to be shared with more and more Romans as time goes on. Now, How popular do you think that was with the aristocrats? Ha ha! It wasn't. It was not. Uh, the aristocrats did not like this at all. It's a zero-sum game. Political power is a zero-sum game. Whatever power the plebeians had was less power that the aristocracy, that the nobility had. And when it comes to getting your share of limited resources, the aristocrats did not like that. They wanted uh, a larger share of these resources. Now, again, we'll talk about uh, how and why they started acting badly uh, fairly shortly. But for now, the main thing you need to know is that rather than proceeding on from a simple kingship to an autocracy, what they did was they sort of veered left and they got rid of the king and replaced him with a system of rule of law. Okay. And that rule of law was modified and expanded over hundreds of years so that more and more people had access to fair treatment and representation and had access to shaping the future of that rule of law. Okay, so that's the basic setup there. All right. Now, let's take a detour. I'm going to pause here. This is where I would ask questions like, is everyone with me? Anyone have any questions? But this is a video, so you can't tell me if you have any questions. We're trapped. You're trapped on the other end of your screen. Let me out. Let me out. That got weird. Sorry. Whatever. Like you don't expect that with me. But anyway, we're going to take a detour into public and private institutions. Okay, so more slides. A private relationship is your personal relationship to somebody, your personal connection to them. If you have a family member or a friend who owes you money, you're probably going to try to work that out privately, assuming it's not like a huge amount of money. Like if it's, $10, you're not going to call the cops. You're going to go to them and you're going to work that out personally. You have a situation, you need to resolve it, and you interact on a one-to-one basis with this person. Now, imagine you have a fender bender, a little minor accident while driving with a stranger. You're probably not going to work it out privately. I mean, you might, but you're probably not. You guys are going to contact your insurance companies, and the insurance companies will probably work it out. But if there's a problem and they don't want to pay, or they're disputing whose fault it was, you'll wind up involving the courts and stuff like that. And depending on when and where and how it happens, maybe there had to be a police report or something. This is a situation where you do not use just a personal, private arrangement to figure out what happens next. What happens next is that you and the person with whom you had your accident interact via other institutions, law enforcement officers, the courts, things like that. A third party becomes involved that mediates between you and the other individual, and your interaction is not private in that respect. Now, some institutions, like insurance agencies, are private institutions. The others are public institutions, like the courts and the law enforcement agents. And public institutions are valuable because, in theory, they will, in theory, this is super duper in theory, they must treat all of us equally, or at least in a consistent fashion as prescribed by law. Because what happens is we as a society get together and create these public institutions. Or, more accurately, in a republic, we elect people who then create them on our behalf. And so, if I have a problem with someone else in the society, I don't handle it privately on a personal level. I handle it through these public institutions. And the public institution doesn't have any stake in who wins, in theory. In theory. In theory, the public institution views me and the other person I have my issue with, like my little accident, my collision. In theory, the public institution does not care which one of us wins. It's going to apply the rules in a neutral and consistent fashion in order to ensure that order is maintained. Now, your interactions, your connection to most other people in this society is a public connection, not a private connection. There are some people you know and you can work things out with on a personal level, but generally speaking, most people you interact with via, sort of mediated by these public institutions. You have no private personal relationship to them. You only have the relationship to them of being a fellow member of society who is also responsible to these public institutions. Okay. Now there's a couple of things to notice here. First, the rule of law and the development of public institutions go hand in hand. The rule of law creates public institutions. And it creates a sense of identity. That's the other thing to notice. It creates a sense of identity that goes beyond your personal relationships. Think about the simple kingship model. You are a member of a family in that model. If you need to get something done, you can appeal to your family to help you. If your family has allies in other families, if your family has made an alliance with another family, you can appeal to them. If your family is responsible to another family, you can appeal to that family maybe. If you have friends or personal connections, you can use those. But that's it. All of these connections are personal. There's no rule of law. There's just a bunch of personal connections. Even the king is an individual who uses his personal connections with the rest of the aristocracy to get them to cooperate. Okay. Now, when the rule of law becomes a thing, in Athens it didn't last very long. It didn't last very long. The Roman rule of law, the Roman public institutions are much more of a model for our society than Athens was. But when Rome gets its res publica, its republic going, and it creates the rule of law, the reason why they say it is a public thing and that it belongs to the people of Rome, all people of Rome, that's not just rhetoric. Even though the aristocrats were running the show, the fact is that everybody in Rome every citizen of Rome, no matter how low class or poor they were, as long as they were a citizen, had a new kind of identity as a Roman citizen. It didn't matter what family they were in. It didn't matter what personal connections they had. I mean, it did, and we'll talk about why. But in theory, they have this relationship to all the other citizens that runs through the institutes of the Roman Republic, the public institutions as created by law. So, this is the moment of creation of the public self, so to speak, of a persona, of a side of your identity that is not tied to your personal connections, but that is embodied in this legal framework. You use this aspect of yourself all the time. Think of traffic. When you drive anywhere, you know, if you come to a place where there are other cars, you guys don't all stop and get out and decide who's going to go next. You're like, all right, let me introduce myself. My name's Langan. I'm a professor. What's your name? Jim? Nice to meet you, Jim. Jim, why don't you tell the group why you think you should go next, and then I'll speak, and then we'll all take turns, and we'll work it out together. That doesn't happen. That's ridiculous. That's absurd. What happens is that we all interact with each other on the basis of a set of traffic laws and on the basis of traffic signs and signals and things like that. We are not personally working out what to do. We are receiving, all of us, information and instructions in the form of things like lines on the road and traffic lights and signs and so forth that is being communicated to us from the public institutions that we as a group created. So, we are interacting with each other through the medium, through the mediation of the public institutions. Okay. Fair enough. Very well. Everyone with me? No questions? I don't hear any questions. Ha! That was very Pee Wee Herman. I apologize for that. I should always apologize for that. Anyway, I don't hear any questions, so I'm going to assume there aren't any. That's good practice. In all seriousness, there will be discussion boards on Blackboard where you will have an opportunity to ask questions that I can clarify for you. But anyway, finally working. Okay, I don't hear any questions. So, why am I telling you all this? Well, because two reasons. First of all, the key thing about public institutions is that, in a way, they are fragile. They depend upon the cooperation of the public. They depend upon the cooperation of the people that they mediate for. If we all decided to stop obeying the traffic laws at once, as a group, all of us, not one of us, but all of us, that's it. It's done for. The traffic laws are over. I mean, they still exist on the books, and the lines are still there on the roads, but there aren't enough police to arrest all of us. It would just be, that would be the end of it. If we all decided to stop obeying the traffic laws as a group, there would not be any traffic laws, effectively. It would be anarchy. This is similar. See, I saw something similar to this in China. There are lines and signals and things like that. There are far fewer traffic signals there, but still, there are some. And the thing is, the Chinese in general ignore them. They ignore the lines on the roads. Like, for instance, on the interstate, I guess, the highway, whatever you want to call it. It's not technically an interstate. But on the highway between Xinjiang and Zhengzhou, there are 3 lanes running north to Zhengzhou. Uh, but I generally, on the few times I was brave enough to venture onto that highway, uh, in a taxi cab always. I did not have my Chinese driver's license, and I was not about to try to get one. I'm not that. I'm not that tired of living yet. Um, in general, I usually saw like 4 lanes worth of traffic. And how did that happen, you may ask? You're like, how did that happen? I thought there were only 3 lanes. Well, there's only 3 lanes marked. But there will be people in cars too, not motorcycles or scooters. People in cars, if the cars are sufficiently small and they see a space, they'll try to worm their way between 2 other cars. And someone will follow them. And then there's basically 4 lanes of traffic on a 3-lane road. And that happens. People on scooters just go wherever the hell they feel like on the roads. Against traffic, everything. They'll perpendicular to traffic. They'll go in any damn direction they want. Nobody pays any attention to the traffic laws. And if there is an accident, what happens is, in China, the custom is not to call the police or notify insurance or anything like that. You get out and you argue about who was at fault, and finally somebody pays somebody else some money that they had in their pocket, and then everyone drives away. That's just what they do. They do not involve the public institutions at all. It's bonkers. Why do they do this? Well, we'll make some speculation on that shortly. But the point is, if public institutions if people start ignoring them or neglecting them, they no longer have power. The rule of law loses its effectiveness. There's an example. One of the most stark and horrifying examples in American history was when the Supreme Court, in a particular case under Andrew Jackson, the Supreme Court made a ruling saying that he could not legally remove the Cherokee people in the East from their lands. He could not force them west. And Jackson said, okay, let's see them stop me. That's it, man. And he did it. And the soldiers that he ordered to remove the Cherokee people and send along what we call the Trail of Tears, the soldiers went along with it. They didn't say, hey, there's a Supreme Court order that says you can't do this. I'm not going to do that. Everybody just went along with it. Technically, it was illegal. It was illegal for him to do that. By any reasonable definition, it was illegal. The courts had made their ruling, and it was illegal when the president did it. It was illegal for every one of the soldiers to carry out that order, but they all just did it anyway. And imagine what would happen if that was the general practice, right? If the Supreme Court makes a ruling in 1964 that the police have to inform you of your rights, the United States versus Miranda. This is why it's the Miranda warnings. 64? I think it's 64. Anyway. I have a computer right in front of me. I can look that up, I guess, but I'm not going to. Anyway, imagine if all the police departments had just ignored it and just said, no, we're not going to do that. What happens to the authority of the Supreme Court? Does it have any authority anymore? You tell me. Okay. Public institutions mediate our interactions with each other, but they are vulnerable to people not participating in them, not giving them their authority. And this is going to be a crucial element, a major contributing factor, the disintegration of public institutions, to the collapse of the Roman Republic. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. I'm going to pause this and go take care of some stuff, get another soda and stuff, and I'll be back. So just, I don't know, take a walk or stretch your legs or something, or what have you. I'll be right back. Okay, we're back. Hooray! All right, so we were talking about institutions, public institutions, and why they're important. Now, I kept saying in theory a lot when mentioning public institutions are going to treat all of us equally. And we all know why. It's bullshit. Public institutions are biased in favor of certain segments of society, at least in America, and basically everywhere, different groups, of course. They're never as good as they are on paper. Their value is in treating us all equally, and they never actually managed to do that. So that's a problem. In Rome, this problem was particularly acute. It was acute. It was a big problem because, obviously, the public institutions were supposed to be for all Romans, but they were controlled by, at least initially, the wealthy Romans, which means that the aristocrats, the nobility, were the ones who could be elected to these offices, who had influence over the powers of these offices, and so on and so forth. And they naturally gave preference to members of their own class and people that they had personal connections to. So what you see here is personal connections interfering with the public institutions. Now, we know all about this. This is just nepotism, as they call it. And we have rules against it. Like if you have a public trust in America nowadays, you are supposed to avoid giving favor to friends, to members of your family, so on and so forth, things like that. The Romans did not have any such prescriptions. And this wound up being a major part of the downfall of their public institutions and therefore of their republic. The two are the same. The republic just is the public institutions. So if the public institutions come unraveled, the republic goes bye-bye, and that's it. Now, a crucial element of this, so as the plebeians, the common people, got more and more access to and control over the public institutions, that still left a lot of them out in the cold. And even the relatively wealthy people who were not part of the right background. So if you who didn't have the right family history. So imagine if you are descended from plebeians, from common folk, but you get rich through some, I don't know, through trade or something like that. You start a business, you get rich. You still couldn't be in the Senate. You still couldn't hold certain elected offices because you didn't have the right family background. And you would still be shut out of the mechanisms of power to a certain extent. So one way that common Romans coped with this was the development of the patron-client system. This is crucial. And it's so crucial, I'm going to use another slide. My God. Is that how serious it is? He's putting up a slide. So, as you can see on the slide, there are the personal relationships and then the public relationships. Very cool. That's as normal. But the patron-client system, new slide, pow! The patron-client system changed that up a little bit by leveraging the increased access and power of the wealthy. What would happen is this. A client, which is say either a poor person or a wealthy person without the right family background, would approach someone who's in the right position, wealthy, noble, so on and so forth, access to the levers of power in society. And they would say, hey, I need something done via the public institutions. And the wealthy person might say, well, I don't know, fill out a form or chisel a tab, whatever the hell the Romans did. Fill out a form. And they're like, no, no, no. I know that things will get done better and quicker if you ask them rather than if I ask them. Because while we're both Roman citizens, we're still not exactly equal. Okay. And so the patron, that is to say the wealthy person, says, well, what's in it for me? And if you are a wealthy person with no good family background, with no political connections, you can say, well, look, I can give you money. And if you're a poor person, you can say, well, I can vote however you want me to vote in the next election, or my family can provide service to your family household, or whatever. You can work out something. And the wealthy person will go in and they'll use their connections and influence to get whatever it is done for their client. Now, this is a subversion of the public institutions. They're not supposed to work that way. This means that if you are a poor person and you want justice, the only way to get it is to get a wealthy person to get it for you. Right? If the system was working properly, if the public institutions were actually functioning in the correct way and treating everyone equally and fairly, then you would not only would you not need a wealthy person to go in and make sure everything gets done the way that you need it to get done. It wouldn't be possible for them to do that. It wouldn't be possible for them to exert their influence in that fashion. So what happens is the influence of the patrons short circuits the proper functioning of the public institutions into the favor of the client. So the client and the patron develop a relationship that kind of, it doesn't necessarily cut out the public institutions, although it might. Like, at various points in Roman history, there was a dole, a grain dole, to help support starving Romans, which is to say the government paid for and distributed food so that Roman citizens didn't starve during difficult times on the theory that they would still need those people when things picked back up. Okay. Kind of like food stamps, I guess. But imagine if the public institutions are not giving out the grain in a fair way. They're giving it out mainly to clients, poor people, who have patrons that can influence how the grain is distributed, right? That's, damn. And imagine you're someone whose patron can't influence that. You just go to your patron for food. You don't even get it from the government at all. So it's a bad situation to be in. Now, why would anyone tolerate this kind of behavior? Well, this goes back to my example about, for instance, Jackson and his order to remove the Cherokees from the east and send them along the Trail of Tears out west. Why would anyone tolerate that kind of thing? Well, public sentiment was not on the side of the Native Americans. A large number of interested parties wanted that land. They did not want to let the Native American peoples have that land. They wanted it for white people. And so they didn't care. They were content to allow the president and the soldiers to break the law without kicking up a fuss about it. The law isn't magic, right? It doesn't just, like, it's not like there's a magical spell cast across the land that when someone tries to break the law, they can't. Uh, if someone tries to break the law, the reason why they can't get away with it is because the police stop them. The law enforcement officials stop them. And if the police won't stop them, then maybe the public will. Maybe the public will create a disruption or a strike or a protest or what have you until the institutions decide to do their job. And no one did. There was no one to prevent this. Um, the soldiers came and executed an order illegally. And the people who weren't soldiers, who vastly outnumbered the soldiers, the regular white people, let them do it rather than trying to stop them from doing it because they wanted the results of that illegal action. So why would the Roman society tolerate the corruption of their public institutions? Well, the people in a position to stop it, the aristocrats and the other people with influence, let it go. Um, in America, the theory of checks and balances is that, like, for instance, that the Supreme Court and the legislature will not allow the president to get away with overextending his reach of doing more than he's allowed to do, because that would mean they would lose power. Remember, political power is a zero-sum game. We said it before. That means they would lose power. Um, but what they didn't count on was the idea that the people in the Senate and on the Supreme Court would see themselves as being on the same team as the president in some relevant way, like in the same party. And they're like, oh, it's fine if the president does more than he's allowed to do because he's on our side, and we're okay with that, as long as our side wins. And if they do, if they decide not to punish the president for doing things that he's not supposed to do because he's on their side and all they care about is their side winning, then the public institutions are not functioning the way they're supposed to function. They're not doing what they're supposed to do. This is what was happening in Rome. The Roman aristocracy, none of them objected to the patron-client system because they benefited from it. The people who could have stopped it didn't. Well, you say, what happens as more and more plebeians gain access? Well, that's the next part of the story. Rome was enjoying internal peace, which is to say it didn't have civil wars or serious political violence for hundreds of years, until about the 2nd century BCE, the 100s, that is. And it was around this time that two things started happening in Rome. First of all, Rome started to get really large, not in terms of the city, but in terms of the amount of territory it controlled. Rome spent the first few hundred years just sort of slowly taking over Italy. And then by the 2nd century, it started busting out and started to control huge amounts of territory beyond Italy. Spain, North Africa, the Greek mainland pretty soon. It very rapidly took over a whole lot of territory. Now, more territory means more money, more resources. And that means that The people in control of the republic have control over more and more resources, more wealth, more power. But the other thing that had been happening in this last period, in the third century, the 200s, was that the plebeians had started getting more and more and more control. Until finally, what happens in the second century is, I guess, my theory is that they just hit their tipping point. Um, with so much new territory under Roman control and so much more wealth flowing into Rome and thus through the Republic, the stakes for control of the Republic were higher than ever before. It wasn't just that you could be wealthy, you could be super wealthy if you could corrupt the public institutions. So the stakes are higher than they've ever been. And the plebeians were poised, thanks to some very influential politicians who were on the side of the plebeians. The plebeians were poised to gain an enormous amount of power, to institute major reforms in the government. Uh, and so what happened? Well, if you watch the other videos, you know the Roman aristocracy murdered the shit out of them. Two brothers, and they just killed them. Not like in a subtle way either. One of them was chased through the streets and beaten to death and thrown in the river. And this man was an elected official of Rome. He was a tribune, a representative of the people. That would be like, imagine, oh my God. So imagine if a representative in the Senate said, "Hey, we're gonna pass the Medicare expansion and make healthcare available to everybody," and a bunch of other senators who are deep in the pocket of the insurance industry and don't want that to happen, instead of just yelling at him and calling him names, imagine if they just straight up walked across the Senate floor and killed that dude. Um, so that would be crazy. Hang on a second. Okay, so anyway, yeah. Imagine if a bunch of senators who were indebted to the insurance companies just walked over and murdered the dude who wanted to have Medicare for all on the Senate floor, and everyone just let them. Uh, at that point, you no longer have a functioning legislature. You don't. At that point, your public institutions are screwed. Uh, you have some people who can do whatever the hell they want, and other people who can't. And that's just how it is. And that's what happened in Rome. Uh, the downfall, Kala, I am doing a thing. The murder of the Gracchus brothers, two pro-plebeian politicians in the 2nd century BCE, that is the beginning of the end of the Republic. Because these were duly elected officials who were attempting to alter the balance of power, and the people who would have been negatively impacted by altering the balance of power just straight up killed them for it, because they knew they would succeed. And rather than allow that to happen, they straight up murdered them publicly. And the next 100 years, roughly, less than, the next 100 years are 150. The next 150 years of Roman history, again, as you saw very briefly in one of the other videos, The next 150 years of Roman history are civil wars, insurrections, riots, uprisings, one after another, because the public institutions have effectively stopped functioning. And why have they stopped functioning? Because of a 300-year-long tradition that slowly built up of the aristocracy ignoring and interfering with the public institutions anyway. I mean, where did you think that was going to lead? For 300 years, they're going to uh, slowly building tradition of, rather than people interacting with the public institutions in the usual way, of them going to patrons, becoming clients to patrons, and having their patron override or interfere with or mess with the public institutions to the individual benefit of themselves and their client. Is it any surprise that eventually the aristocracy, the patron class, decided to stop respecting the institutions altogether? Is that a shock? No, it's not. Of course it's not. I mean, that was what was going to happen. So, how does it all end? Well, how it all ends is with the Roman Empire. Um, Although it wasn't technically called that. I mean, at first. And it's complicated. All right. At the end of it all, as the other videos you watch should have explained, Julius Caesar was kind of sort of deeply corrupt. He was a very effective and charismatic politician, but he was deeply, deeply, deeply corrupt. He did not respect the public institutions, and he tried to get around them whenever he could, like pretty much every other major aristocrat in Rome. What made him different was that he got put in a situation where he had to either play along with the public institutions and report back to Rome to stand trial like a good boy, or uh, commit civil war, march on Rome with his own army, and take over. Now, the people who put him in that position, I'm not sure what about his character made them think that he was going to do anything other than commit civil war, but that's what he did. And he fought Julius Caesar, and he eliminated his opposition, and then he pardoned the rest of them, and he took over Rome. And he ruled with dictatorial power. Now, dictator, we call a dictator someone who rules sort of unilaterally by subverting or sidestepping the public institutions. That's what we call a dictator. Dictator just comes from the Latin word for one who speaks, the person who speaks, that is, the person whose word is as law. What they say goes is a way of thinking of it. And dictator was an office. Very hilariously, Caesar got himself voted dictator to deal with the crisis, which is a crisis that he caused by marching an army into Rome. But then he got himself voted dictator to deal with the crisis. And finally, right before they killed him, he got himself voted dictator for life, which means that he was going to rule like a king, basically. Um, The senators killed him, stabbed him to death in the hopes of restoring the republic. But this was a ridiculous thing to do, because Caesar was not what was wrong with the republic. What was wrong with the republic had its roots in hundreds of years of aristocratic meddling in the public institutions. Caesar didn't start it, and killing him certainly wasn't going to finish it. His nephew Octavian, who changed his name to Augustus later as emperor, his nephew Octavian, technically speaking, did not have the title of emperor. He had the title of first man of the Senate. He was technically a senator, technically just another citizen of Rome. But using those personal connections, he's using that personal power. He subverted the institutions of Rome. And he did a lot of things that were technically illegal, or at least kooky. And he took on power onto himself. Like, you weren't supposed to have more than one elected office at a time. But Augustus just got out there and declared that he had all the powers of not only a consul, but also a censor and all kinds of other elected offices of Rome, and people just went along with it. You can break the law if people decide to let you break the law, if the right people. And the right people did. He had enough people frightened of him, enough people that had the strength to oppose him killed, and enough people that just wanted some peace and quiet, which he promised, that he broke the law and was not punished for it, because the people who were in a position to punish him said, whatever. And that's how Rome becomes an empire. That's how a republic stops being a republic. It was still branded as a republic. That was still what was on the label, right? The Republic of Rome, in theory. Is that how it worked? Absolutely not. Augustus, one guy, and his close friends ran everything. They did whatever the hell they wanted, because the only people who were in a position to stop them decided not to. And the institutions were done for. The Senate was supposed to consult on any important legislation or anything like that. Augustus put an end to that. The Senate became effectively a debating society. It had no power anymore. And because people stopped listening to them. I mean, imagine a small town. You're in Oklahoma, you don't have to imagine a small town. Imagine a small town, and there's one police officer in town, just one guy. And everybody decides to stop listening to him. Everybody. The courts, the mayor, everybody. No one will recognize his authority. Does he still have any? No. No, he doesn't. On paper, sure, but he doesn't have any authority, not in any real sense. The Senate lost its power. People stopped listening to it. People started listening to Augustus. Why? Because Augustus said, killed off everyone who could possibly mean to oppose him. And he could give them what he wanted. It was the logical consequence of every bit of this. It was the logical consequence of Roman meddling, the tradition of aristocrats meddling with the public institutions. It was always only ever going to end up back in some form of authoritarian rule. So the Romans developed public institutions because they didn't want to have a king. They didn't want arbitrary authority vested in one person. The aristocracy as a class controlled those public institutions. But over hundreds of years, the non-aristocrats, the plebeians, the common people like you and me, slowly clawed out more and more influence over these institutions, eroding the aristocrats' control over society. Eventually, when the stakes were really high, because there was a lot of money at stake, and when the aristocrats faced maybe their first really tough opposition from the plebeians, and the plebeians looked really positioned to move into genuine popular control over the government, the aristocrats stepped completely outside of the public institutions, which they had been doing on a small scale for hundreds of years. They completely flouted the public institutions and murdered the opposition. This kicked off 200 years of, or 150 years of civil war and insurrection and political and social infighting until finally the popular movement was defeated. The institutions of Rome, the public institutions of Rome, had been totally ruined, and arbitrary rule by one person came back. Only now, Rome has so much wealth and power that it could be kind of like an autocracy rather than like a simple kingship. The emperor could control so much power and wealth that he could kind of rule in a top-down fashion. So in a sense, Rome started with simple kingship, lacked the resources to develop autocracy, turned left into rule of law and a republican society, which never reached its full potential as a genuinely public society ruled by the masses, and eventually fell backwards into being an autocracy of sorts. Fun times. Oh well, so much for the rule of law. Never lasts. How long did Rome last? Oh, longer than America has so far. Oops. I'm going to audition to be your next autocrat. I'm kidding. Anyway, come here. Come here. All right, that was another cat, but he doesn't want to be on camera, I guess. Anyway, so hopefully that was helpful to you. The gradual slide into authoritarianism from the public, the res publica, the republic. I want you to take away from all of this how public and private institutions, the public sphere is where you operate as when you operate through the public institutions. The private sphere is where you operate in your personal life, your personal connections. I want you to take away from this how the development of the public sphere was related to the public institutions and the rule of law, and why the destruction of the public institutions led directly to the empire. How the authoritarian rule of an emperor, how that could have only happened when the public institutions were wiped out, and how the patron-client system played a role in destroying the public institutions. All right, that's the thing. That's the thing you need to know here. All right, have a good week. Don't not wash your hands. I don't know what to tell you. Take up a hobby, learn to knit, whatever. Take vitamin D because you're not going to see the sun very much. Have a good one, and I'll see you on the next video. Bye.